Tom Campbell here. I and MBT Events hope you like this video. It was made possible by donations from our supporters. If you're one of them, thank you so very, very much. If you're new to MBT and find something of significant value in our videos, please consider supporting their production through our Patreon account or through a one-time donation. It would be very much appreciated. The links are in the description below. Thank you.
Welcome to the second part of our discussion on conscious computers. I'm here again with Tom Campbell, and in this part of the discussion, we are going to discuss how to build a computer avatar that could host a consciousness unit. So, in my understanding of your model, Tom, we basically need to create an avatar that can be played by an individuated unit of consciousness and create this avatar in a way that this IUOC would want to play that avatar. And we also need to somehow enable that IUOC to play this game by giving it an appropriate data stream. So I guess my first question about this is, what do you think should really be our goal when we try to build this kind of avatar?
Well, first, let me say that technically, there are all kinds of IUOCs, individuated units of consciousness, which means there could be all kinds of avatars. So when we talk about this, we probably are, most of your listeners are thinking human, a human avatar. We're talking about a consciousness that is human-like. But I should point out that avatars can be, cats and dogs and horses, as well as people, and even down into the insect world, maybe bumblebees. Who knows how far that goes? I define a consciousness as awareness with a choice. And the key thing there is with a choice. So does a bumblebee actually make free will choices? Or is it just hardwired? Well, it would take some biologists, I guess, doing some studies to figure that out for sure. But it's surprising how low that hierarchy can go. You don't have to make a lot of choices. Now, at the pinnacle of that choice-making hierarchy is probably human beings. We have more choices. Now, we don't have the largest brain. Dolphins have bigger brains than we do, and they actually have a more developed cerebral cortex. The frontal lobes of their brain are very highly developed. But they don't have nearly the choices we have because they don't have the opposable thumb. They can't grab things. They can't build structures. There's a lot of things that they can't do. There's a lot of possibilities that we have that they don't have, be another way to put it. The range of possible things that humans can accomplish is a lot bigger than the potential range of things that dolphins can accomplish. As far as we're talking about accomplishments in the physical world, the avatar accomplishing out in the physical world. So we humans are kind of at the apex of the size of decision space. We have the greatest decision space in all the choices that we know we have, which does not include all the choices that we don't know we have. So when we talk about avatars and individuated units of consciousness playing avatars, then we have to realize it's a very general subject. It's not just about humans. And does the larger conscious system play horses and cats and dogs and bumblebees like it plays humans? Maybe, probably not so much, in the sense that if you get to bumblebees and ants, you might not have a player for every ant, say. You may have a player for the hive. That would be a possibility. And the reason for that would be that the ant doesn't necessarily make enough independent choices, the individual ant, to require a full-time choice maker, a full-time player to play those choices. If the choices are simple and repetitive and so on, then having a full-time choice maker is not really that practical. So there's different ways this can be constructed. We're talking about just one of those many possibilities in our conversation. We're talking about a human-like consciousness in a not so human-like avatar, being the computer. And that is a very different thing. One should at least have the thought that can a consciousness in a computer end up being very much like a human? You see, part of what makes us human and makes us act the way we do, yes, we are a piece of consciousness, but that consciousness is limited by our biology. That consciousness is limited at what it can do with the avatar by the rule set, okay, of the virtual reality. The rule set of the virtual reality basically is, of course, the biology. It's the physics, the chemistry, the biology, the rule set of the virtual reality, all the rules that decide how things can change, interchange, what energy can do. So consciousness logs on to play a human, but is constrained in what it can do with that human by the rule set of the game, which is biology. So it grows up within that envelope of possibilities. Well, the possibilities that go with being human and having a body, like we have, are going to be a different set of possibilities than if you grow up as a computer and have to obey the rule set that describes the computer, the things the computer can do and cannot do. So if you have a consciousness that evolves within computers, that's likely not going to turn out to be just like a human consciousness, because it will have evolved within a different set of constraints, provided by the rule set. So it's just a thing that we understand. So we will certainly have a computer that is conscious, that an individuated unit of consciousness has logged onto it. But how is that consciousness then going to develop within the limits that the rule set places on a computer? Obviously, it's not going to jump and run and play games and do things like that. It's a computer. And obviously, it can do some things much better than humans can do. It certainly can add very quickly. It can do lots of complex things, has huge memory. So it has attributes that far exceed ours in some ways. And it has other attributes that are far less than what we have in other ways. So we shouldn't expect consciousness evolving within the computer avatar to necessarily be just like consciousness that evolved in the human avatar. So that's kind of a concept, as we talk about building, how we get consciousness into the avatar. How do we build up this avatar for consciousness? Just want to keep that in mind. So human-like is more defined by the evolution of the avatar within the constraints of the VR's rule set past experiences of being human. Okay. All of its interactive moments, all of its interactive environments, that's what makes the human consciousness what it is. The question is, how do we create an avatar that would be of interest to consciousness? Well, that avatar, how do we recreate? How do we create an avatar that's basically a computer? That's what we're talking about. That would be of interest to consciousness. I think we've already established last time that the way the process works is that if you have an avatar, potential avatar, that is attractive to consciousness as far as enabling consciousness to evolve by playing the choices of that avatar, then consciousness will log on and play that avatar. But we have to build something that consciousness would want to play. And since consciousness primarily wants to evolve itself, lower its entropy by making choices, and those choices have to do with choices moving toward love as opposed to moving toward fear. Now we can look at a human and see all kinds of possibilities of choices that have to do with, moving toward love and moving toward fear. With computers, it's going to be a little different, just because that consciousness is has a different set of limitations than we do, and a different set of interactions. But the consciousness, the larger conscious system, can still find a lot of value in logging on to a computer that is making interesting choices. So what do choices have to be in order to be interesting to consciousness? The larger conscious system would find it interesting if that computer made choices that affected itself and other humans. I shouldn't say other humans, other computers and humans. If it affected them in a very meaningful way, it created choices for the humans, created choices for itself, was interactive in a process. Not just a computer going off and computing things and doing things that computers do, but a computer that was interactive with its environment, which is going to include both computers and humans. If those interactions with the humans require it to make choices that have, strong effects on other computers or on humans, then those are choices that are very meaningful. How do you make those? In which case, the larger conscious system would want to log on to that particular computer's making those kinds of choices. If you had a computer that wasn't making those kinds of choices, was just, playing a video game or doing something else, counting beans, doing things like that, then you could maybe get a piece of consciousness to log on and play that computer that doesn't make a whole lot of interesting choices, but it wouldn't be a very interesting consciousness either. See, that's why I started this. Yes, you might get a conscious computer at the level of a bumblebee or at the level of a cat or a dog, if that's the kind of level of attractiveness you would get. If you want a computer to act more like a human, then you would have to give it a decision space more like a human's. What can humans do? How can humans interact? How can humans affect each other? How can, humans create challenges for each other? All of this is part of the soup that makes humans a very good, very rich avatar. Lots of interaction, lots of choices, lots of connections. The choices are constantly changing and growing and modifying. And if you have that kind of an environment, then yes, I think you would have, that kind of environment in a computer, then yes, I think there would be no restraints of consciousness to log on and want to play it. Because the larger consciousness system is interested in lowering its entropy. I think we discussed, what that means last time, so I won't go over that here. And however it can do that, it will do that. It will explore all of its ways in which it can do that. So now you see, it's not just as simple as making the right avatar and then having a computer show up that sounds like Victor or sounds like Tom, it's a little more complicated in that the computer that you make, it's not just the hardware, it's what does it do? What does it control? How does it interact? How much depth is that interaction? How significant is that interaction? How does its choices affect others? So those are the kind of things that you'd have to look at when trying to produce an avatar, a computer avatar that would attract an individuated unit of consciousness to play its choices. If you wanted to act more human-like than bumblebee-like, then you need to give it more human-like choices, obligations, responsibilities, connections, and moral choices. You'd have to give it more of those, and then you would get something more like a human. But you probably never, even if you can do that, you probably never get that computer consciousness to be just like a human, because being just like a human has to do with growing up, being born, being small, being a child, learning, growing, interacting, having parents. All of that stuff, goes into making us and who we are and the choices that we have, and all of that tends to bias the way that the consciousness can work with that biology of that avatar. In other words, we change. The consciousness is constrained by what our chromosomes, allow us to do, what our DNA allows us to do. It has its limitations. So the computer isn't going to have chromosomes and DNA that gives off zillions of possibilities, perhaps. It may need some other way of creating uniqueness and special personality and personality traits. But if the computer is going to be, well, here's what the computer does and this is his job, and that job may affect people, it may make moral choices. But if it's just narrow like that, and that's all it does, then the consciousness is going to be very flat and not have a lot of depth to it, because it just does those 100 things, or maybe even 200 things. If it only does 5 things, then it's going to be more like the bumblebee. But if it does 200 things, it's going to be different. But humans have, millions of choices, of different kinds of choices that they do. So that's one of the issues in building an avatar. It's not so much as what's the hardware and software as it is what's going to be its role, its significance. What decision space are you going to give it, where it has free will choice to make these choices? And everybody else has to deal with that. See, that's the way it is with humans. We have free will choices, and everybody else has to deal with our choices. I mean, they may deal with them by putting us in jail if we make really horrible choices. That's how they deal with it. But, how we get along and what we learn and how we grow affects everybody else. Now, we create a computer such that it makes choices and we have to deal with it. And that's sort of like us. That creates responsibility, because now you affect things. Responsibility creates moral and ethical choice. So, you see, it just depends. So if you want to build a computer that basically does accounting for a corporation, or balances the electrical grid, or does something like that, well, yeah, there's ethical choices involved there. But that kind of consciousness isn't going to act like we do, like a human, because it doesn't have our experiences. It doesn't have our all the things we grow and how we grow up, and all those patterns, all those interactions, all those things that we have to deal with. People are in families, and sometimes the mother and father are so busy they ignore the children a lot, and then the children grow up with attitudes that they're not good enough, or they're not competent or not lovable or nobody cares about them. And they have these attitudes, not because the parents didn't love them, because it was just the situation. They spent most of their time in daycare and in the care of others than they actually did with their parents, because their parents each had to work 2 jobs just to put food on the table. So you see, we have all kinds of different things in humanity that creates stresses and changes. And children like that who have those kinds of fears and feelings, they actually change their physical body. They change their biology to help fit their consciousness. Consciousness leads, the body follows. So the body will adjust itself somewhat to express the consciousness. But it has to do that within the limits of the rule set. So now how does that apply to a computer? So you see, the computer environment and the nature of the computer is something that comes off an assembly line and has certain characteristics, like, how much RAM does it have and how fast is it? And, it's got these characteristics, but that's like it's equivalent to DNA, I guess. It defines kind of basically its performance capabilities, the things it can do. But that's going to tend to be limited compared to the possibilities of a human, of a Homo sapiens, and the possibilities of things that they could do. So my point is, they're not going to be just the same. So the idea that we're going to get a conscious computer and it's going to be just like Viktor and Tom. Now, let's say you make a computer and put it as the controller of a robot. And this robot, looks like Viktor or Tom and goes around doing those kinds of things. Childcare, takes care of children, cleans houses, has a job at the bank, whatever. It gets integrated into the culture, where now it doesn't have the birth experience and that learning experience, but it has all the social interaction. It just starts life as an adult, you might say. It starts life with all of its capacity already developed. It doesn't have to develop that capacity over 50 years. So it's going to be different in that respect. But then you would have a computer that has a lot of the same choices that humans have. And yes, that consciousness would probably grow to be more human-like. But it wouldn't have still the issues of feeling inadequate, feeling this way or that way, things that humans get out of their upbringing, things that humans pick up usually in the first 5 years of their life, where they have a sexual identity and they get personality traits, their fears develop, and they carry them all through the rest of their life. They deal with these things. They just deal with them differently. When they're 60, they're still dealing with that insecurity that they've been carrying around since they were 5 years old. That's kind of the way humans are. Computers wouldn't have those issues. They would have perhaps different issues. Maybe they're over time, their computational speed would become slow compared to what it was expected to do. Maybe it's expected to handle more and more bigger and bigger chunks of data, and it would have limitations as to what it could do. Well, it can always go back and pull out this memory and stick in some more memory and give it an upgrade. Humans can't do that, and that's going to produce a different kind of impact on that consciousness. If humans could do that, we'd be different. And it would make being a human kind of a different thing. If we could say, oh, I'm getting old now, let me pull out these eyes and stick in some new ones. And, my brain's slowing down because, I'm old. So let me just speed it back up again so that I can do 5 things at a time and keep track of all of them. Computers could do that. They'll have those possibilities. We don't. So we are going to end up with computer consciousness, but it's not going to be Tom and Viktor in a mainframe or in a laptop, because consciousness evolves. It changes, it adapts to its environment and its decision space. So it depends very much on what choices we give it as to how it's going to develop and what it's going to be like. So it is going to be kind of an alien attitude, an alien mindset from us. It's not just going to be human. And see, many people have this idea, well, conscious is consciousness. If it's conscious, okay, it's going to be like a human because that's what consciousness is. So if it's conscious at all, it's going to be just like us. And I don't think that's the case, not necessarily. Some situations could be more like us and others less like us. But you have to have an open mind for all sorts of consciousness at lots of different levels with varying degrees of limitations, attitudes, feelings. So it's probably a good place to start. So how do you build an avatar? Well, we just need one to have something that has free will. And as we discussed last time, free will is the easier constraint, to overcome. Building something with free will simply means that you build something that makes choices and that those choices are not logically hardwired. If this, then that, if that, then another thing, and then that defines the choice. That's what I mean by hardwired. It's something that the software looks at. It's the data, looks through its past history, the things it's done, and the experience that it has, and come to a choice. And the choice may be right, it may be wrong, and nobody really knows exactly how it got to that choice. That's an unknown.
And is it unknown just because humans are not, smart enough to figure out what it is? Or is it more fundamentally?
I think it's both ways. I think it's unknown because the process is too complex and too invisible to follow. Now you could, you may, if you took let's say a neural net for a computer, and maybe you get a very complex neural net, but you had little sensors everywhere that would say exactly when a coefficient got changed and how that affected all the others, and you could keep track of all of that. Would that still be conscious? Well, it may affect the kind of consciousness that you would get from it, but probably not in a sense as it still would be making these choices. Why did it choose to change that coefficient? Why did the system choose to do these things? Well, you could say, well, it's happened because of that or because of that. But eventually that gets to be so deep in, even in a computer, that becomes so deep. You could do that with a human. You could say, okay, light comes in and a human sees something. Now, because they see something, they do this. And because they do this, they do that. You can trace all these little micro potentials all through the human body and see what does what. But that doesn't tell you why that human made the choices that he did. It just tells you that he did make those choices, and that was the progression. And I think you'd have the same thing with a neural net. Even if you examined every little bit that changed in that neural net, you still don't understand why. The why is the neural net looks at its learned experience and makes a choice. Now, and it makes a choice based on that experience. And if all those choices were random, then of course you wouldn't have much of a consciousness or much of a computer, either one. If all of its choices are random, it makes a choice, and that choice then has consequences, and it learns from those consequences, and it has a point, it has a purpose, which for humans is to lower entropy, and for the computer would be about the same, to lower entropy.
When you say it, do you mean the neural net or do you mean the consciousness?
Did I mean what? What are the consciousness?
The neural network or do you
the
mean the consciousness? Like, which is the one that actually makes these choices in the case of a computer? Like, how do we know is it the neural net doing its thing, whatever it was programmed? Or is there something coming from outside, like a consciousness, affecting these things?
Well, the consciousness makes the choice. That's the role of the consciousness. It makes the choice. If there's no consciousness, then the choices are all algorithmic. They're all defined logically. And the computer does what it does because it doesn't have any other choice. It's programmed so that these things happen, it gets that result. And with that kind of a computer, if you start from exactly the same state and you give it exactly the same changes, you'll get exactly the same results out. Nothing changes. That's hardwired. Okay, so consciousness makes choices. Now, if you have a system where consciousness can work, and that would be like a neural net, can have free will in that it can make choices, and it's probably pretty close to impossible to trace how that choice is made. Now, I'm saying that it has the ability to make that choice, but that would be the consciousness would be making those choices. That's what the consciousness would do. If it took that, it would take over those choices. So how does it make the choice before it's the consciousness? You might be thinking it that way. So perhaps the potential for those choices would be enough for a consciousness to want to play and see where that game goes. Or, as it happened with humans, the larger conscious system can play those choices for it, make all those choices, and then let an IUOC, an individuated unit of consciousness, pick them up later if they turn out to be significant. Because remember, the larger consciousness system creates everything. This is a virtual reality. That computer isn't something different, isn't something beyond consciousness. That computer sitting on the desk with that, metals, skin, and all the rest of it, and the view screen and the monitor and so on. That physical thing is not physical. It's computation. It's a virtual thing. It's made by the larger consciousness system, by a rendering engine that runs the virtual reality. And now that virtual thing made by consciousness has a complex system of neural nets, and it's making choices. So it's being created by the larger conscious system to begin with, okay? Out of equations, say, out of logic. It's being created because this is a virtual reality. If the system then thinks, oh, these choices are interesting, these choices have merit, one of my IUOCs could log on and make those choices and learn something. So then get an IUOC, logs on, learns something. So you have to realize that consciousness is the source of that computer to begin with. So consciousness is aware of what it can do and what it can't, the choices it has, and can be making those. Now, how does a neural network work? Okay, we know the basics of it, but how does it actually come up with its choices? Perhaps to a certain level, once those choices get more interesting, it's the larger conscious system making those choices because nobody can tell where it's coming from. It can do that, and
Yes.
nothing shows. So that transition isn't really necessarily such a big transition because it's really construct of consciousness to begin with. Because see, we can see the human body the same way. Say, well, the human body is just a bunch of cells and electrochemical goo, and we can trace neurons and see what they do, and we can go in with a probe and give a little hit electricity on the on the back lobe over here and watch somebody's leg jump, or uh, you know we can control things, so we see it as a machine. But still, that machine can go beyond the physical, can heal someone with their mind or remote view, or do things that have nothing to do with the physical reality. So it's not necessarily clear when is the moment that the computer has free will and how does it get that. It's a matter of what is the computer doing? Is it interesting? Does the system then want to enable an IUOC to learn from that avatar? If it does, then the transition is simple. If it isn't, then it just keeps on chugging its ones and zeros, and maybe it's always just a virtual computer. Doesn't get the IUOC because it's not interesting enough to the source. So yes, there's uncertainty in it, but uncertainty is part of the necessary ingredients. That's what enables humans to do a lot of what they can do is uncertainty. Within the uncertainty, the source, the larger conscious system, can construct, can manipulate
So
within
yeah,
the
so
uncertainty.
you just said like it basically overrides the rules of the neural network and in a very subtle way so that it doesn't get noticed
So that
because
it can't,
so
such that it
complicated.
can't be noticed. Yeah. Not just that it doesn't get noticed, but so that it can't be noticed.
I
If it
see.
can be noticed, then maybe it's not a candidate. Then maybe it's an algorithmic system. But if it can't be noticed, then the system can get involved with that because the system's creating that computer anyway.
So to make this decision that it cannot be noticed, like is it maybe the larger consciousness system looking at all of us humans watching that computer and saying, okay, Tom and Viktor I are looking at this computer and the larger consciousness system says that okay, these people are not smart enough to figure out what's going on in that neural network, so we are free to put an IUOC into it, something like that.
I think something like that, but it probably has a lot deeper thought process than that. But it is like that because it may say, well, they're not smart enough to see what's going on here, but they might be someday. So I don't want to start something that then I get stuck with something that I can't deal with later on when they do get smart. You see, you don't want to build in places where you end up backing yourself into a corner from which you can't extricate yourself. So I'm sure the system is pretty clever about that. It's been doing this for a long time. It's got many other virtual realities besides the one we call the physical universe. So it's experienced and can probably predict reasonably well, what will happen. So it's relatively safe. But if there's something that it can do now because of the situation supports it, it may do that now. And then if that situation changes, let's say the people get smarter. Well, if it has a way out, if it has another way that it can continue, it doesn't paint itself in a corner, then things can change. Just like in our physical universe, we've had the speed of light redefined, several times at about the, I don't know, eighth, ninth, 10th decimal point. I don't remember exactly, but it's, pretty far down the chain from the decimal point. That's because the requirement for the simulation, we call it the resolution requirement, has grown. As long as you have a bunch of cavemen running around with their clubs, you don't need a whole lot of resolution. But when you have physicists with their atom smashers tearing little pieces of particles apart down at the nanometer level, now you need more resolution to support that. But the system can build that in by making the system, okay, the system now has to process more data, but it only has to do it in those circumstances. But there can't be a big change. So it takes the resolution of the system, the delta x, and the resolution in time, the delta t, and that ratio, delta x over delta t, defines the speed of light. So as long as that ratio stays the same, it can make the delta x and delta t smaller or bigger, and doesn't really change much because the ratio is still the same. Speed of light remains about the same, but it's not always the same because delta x and delta t are digits, they're chunks. They're not a continuous thing. They're digital. So you can't have half a digit. You can't say, well, I'll keep the ratio exactly the same. So delta T has to move exactly, you know, what do we call them? 10 units plus a half a unit. You can't move a half a unit. This is digital. You either move 10 units or you move 11 units. 10 and a half units isn't possible. And it's the same with the other. So the delta X over delta T, because those are digital things, can't always keep the exact same ratio, but they can get close. They can get very close. So you get the nearest delta X and nearest delta T that are as close as you can get within the size of the delta X and delta T to that ratio that you had before. And then life goes on. So physicists have realized that over the past, 60 years, 70 years, the speed of light has changed slightly in the, far decimal place. But the far decimal place isn't at the end point of what we can measure, the accuracy we can measure. It's well within the accuracy we can measure. So we know it's a real change. Say we can measure to, I'm just making these numbers up as examples, but say we can measure the speed of light to 10 decimal places. And these are taking place in the 8th decimal place. So we know they're real. They're not just that, our measurements aren't so good, but they're very small, so they don't really make much difference. Mm-hmm. So in any case, that's the case where a system can change things as it goes. Any good computer, virtual reality isn't going to run at any more resolution than it needs to, because that would just be wasted cycles to compute things more detail than what's needed. So you change it as you go. So yes, the computer, the larger conscious system, can change things, can change the rules as it goes, as long as it can keep that almost a secret. Now, it is apparent to us, and partly that's good, because we're smart enough now that we can look at those things and say, this is a little artifact of the fact that this is a digital simulation. The fact that the speed of light changes in the 8th decimal place. It's a little sign, because it's a virtual reality. If it was a virtual reality, that couldn't happen. You wouldn't have the speed of light changing at the 8th decimal place. So it gives us hints. And as we get smart enough, those hints are valuable to us to help us understand the nature of the reality in which we live in. So it's a good thing.
So how did the physicists react to this realization that the speed of light is changing? Because I'm not hearing too many news about that.
No, you don't hear news about that, and it's not that it all happened, last week. This is stuff that physicists have known for, like I say, over the past 70 years. They've realized this. And then, 10, 15 years later, it happened again, that sort of thing. And they don't have any idea why.
I see.
And if you don't have any idea why, no theory, not even an intelligent guess, you don't talk about it very much, because there just isn't much to say. But even probably most physicists don't know about this. But I first heard of it when I was listening to a talk by Rupert Sheldrake, who listed a lot of kind of things that physicists don't really understand, things about our reality that are kind of outside what physics can understand. And that was one of them. And he talked to the guy who was in charge of, I don't know what it is in the UK. In the US, it's, was it something in measure, standards and measures. There's an organization that does things, they define what the meter is, what a second is, and they have ways of doing that. So that group of people measures the speed of light, and they found this. And he talked to that group that was in the UK and was directly reporting, what he was told, that it's changed multiple times and nobody has a clue why, because it doesn't, there isn't any theory that would explain it. So mostly you don't talk about the things that you have to claim that you don't know. You talk about the things that you claim
Hmm.
that you know because you're proud of the fact that you know it. So yeah, that's you can go back to his video. But when I first heard of that, I said, "Oh, that's interesting. That's a new fact. What does my theory have to say about that?" Sure enough, it was obvious. It's a change in the delta X and delta T. You don't want to have any more resolution than you need. It's a waste. And then you don't even want to have any more resolution than you need at that particular time and area. You don't want to essentially make the whole system that high resolution. You just need it to be that resolution there. But when you're actually doing the day-to-day computations, you can go back to that easier,
Hmm.
smaller
Yeah.
resolution.
What's interesting is that the system can still stay consistent. Why? Like maybe they are increasing the resolution at a small area, and then maybe
Mm-hmm.
they have to increase the resolution at a different area. And maybe later in time that kind of has to come together
Yeah,
with a
maybe.
bigger area. And it's still somehow consistent. Like you
Yeah,
just make a very small change, but in a way that you predict that the change can be carried along consistently, even if you have to increase the resolution in the
yeah,
after.
yeah. And like so, that was my point. That it will make changes. It can ad lib and make changes as long as it doesn't paint itself into a corner to where it gets, I made this change and this change. Now I got an inconsistency. How am I going to deal with this? Because there's no way out. Right? Then you have a problem. And actually, we kind of found one of those with the double slit experiment. Before the double slit experiment, we had optics, and optics was around for 100 years before quantum physics, probably 300 years. Optics was been around a long time, focusing light with a lens, and they knew about if you send coherent light. They didn't necessarily know it was coherent, but they took a light source and moved it way back away from the two slits. And that means that the wavefront was almost flat, wasn't flat. If the wavefront's flat, then you have coherency. Everything's in phase. So they would do that, and they get an interference pattern, and they figured all that out, and why that was, and used the wave theory and wavelengths, and why you have places where the superposition is maximum, and places where it's null, and places where it's negative, and they did all that math, and then they come to the point. So the system enabled that science. It supported that. Then we got to the point that somebody said, okay, let's put particles through those or shoot them at those slits one at a time. Well, that was way more than what could have been done when optics was being done. You couldn't do one at a time particles. That wasn't a possibility. So now there was one at a time particles. But the system kind of got caught. Now, it maybe wanted to get caught in this one because, again, it helps us grow up. It shows us something. If we're old enough to do one particle at a time, we're old enough to grow up some and see some bigger pictures. So, what happened then is that because photons don't interact with each other, photons are all independent. It's not like they're in a crowd and they talk in the crowd and make friends and interact. And this photon changes that photon. They're non-interactive. All the photons do whatever they do just as if they were the only photon. They don't influence each other. They don't send out any energy that interacts with each other. So photons are entirely independent, which means logically, it doesn't matter whether you have billions of photons at those two slits or just one, because the photons are all independent. If you send just one at a time, it's going to have to do the same thing as if you send them a billion at a time. There's a problem because we did the wave theory with optics that predicted where the interference patterns would be because of the various wavelengths being retarded or advanced based on the geometry of the slits. But now we had single particles. So what did the system do? It said, all right, if you send single particles through, I'm going to distribute them on a screen exactly the same way I distributed it with the billions of particles because the particles aren't interactive. So you send one particle at a time through, and what you get is an interference pattern. And see, that's what drove the physicists nuts. How do you get an interference pattern with a single particle? So you started hearing silly things like, well, particle must have split in half, gone through both slits, and interfered with itself. Well, that's silly. Particles don't do that. You have these kind of strange things that physicists say, trying to understand how that could happen. Why do single particles put themselves on the screen in an interference pattern? Well, they do. And the system kind of, I think, got caught between a rock and a hard place there. And that was their fix. So it just happens that way. All right, now we have theory that if a particle is traveling in a straight line, it'll continue to travel in that straight line unless it's affected by an exterior force. Well, there are no exterior forces in this game. Single particles go through a slit, and if we were correct about that, they should hit the screen right behind that slit because they're traveling in a straight line. There's no forces on them. But they don't. They arrange themselves in an interference pattern. So that's a place where science went off one way, and then newer science that was more detailed and required a lot more sophistication had to fall in such a way that it did not create a logical inconsistency in the virtual reality. So that's how the double slit worked. So yes, we can have robots and we can have a consciousness, and that may change that. Now, it may change the way that works some, but it doesn't want to block itself in to where it gets in a corner and has to do something really strange to get out. So it needs to be clever enough to not lock itself in like that. Now, again, maybe the fact that it gave us this double slit experiment is just as a wake up. Okay, this is a hint, guys. Go figure out this is a virtual reality, and you can explain that. So that may have been time. If you can send particles one at a time, then you ought to be smart enough to see that this is a virtual reality. So that's maybe one of the clues that was offered, or maybe the system just got caught, and that's what they had to do in order to get out of the trap without creating a logical inconsistency in the virtual reality. Could have happened either way. But doing consciousness is like that. So that computer sitting on your desk is a virtual computer, just like your body is a virtual body. It's the creation of consciousness in a virtual reality. So consciousness is really in control of everything in a virtual reality. The computer is control of everything. So you don't have a lot of interest really in trying to say, well, where's the point where that computer goes from unconscious to conscious? Exactly what's happening there. It's all kind of in a fuzzy slur. It's consciousness. Consciousness has the whole thing. And when consciousness feels like it can get away with it, there's nothing going to show that's not going to make any logical inconsistency. And it might make a good avatar for conscious to learn with, and it can just make that shift and say, all right, I've been making these choices all along, but here, let me take an IUOC and let them make these choices. And they can use that to grow up. But it's not going to do that unless the choices are good.
And the IUOC has to be like up to date on how the neural network works, right? Like, let's say the consciousness system says, look, IUOC, here is a nice neural network for you, start playing it. And from the next choice, they're like, oh, now I have to, play exactly like this neural network has been playing before so that I don't get caught.
No, the IUOC doesn't have to be aware of what's going on because the IUOC is just getting a data stream. It's a player. It gets a data stream that defines the reality. The larger consciousness system configures part of itself as the server, as the computer. So the larger consciousness system has to be aware of, all the irons in the fire, all the logic of the system that's been built up so far. It has to be aware of that. But the IUOC doesn't. The IUOC is just playing a game. So the IUOC is just getting a data stream from the server. The player is getting a data stream from the server. It gets the data, interprets it, and makes choices.
So
Same way we do.
Notice the change that when an IUOC comes in and it's not aware of, what kind of fancy new data stream it has been given.
No, it gets a data stream, and as far as it, when you're in a virtual reality, the way it works is that part you have an IUOC. It takes a part of itself, just a part that represents the overall quality it's gained at this time. That gets logged on, and then has to learn how to deal with the choices it has. Okay, so it then learns what it can do and what it can't do.
But
it doesn't have to come in.
A part of it that is also aware of like, how should I put this? That is kind of has some information about what this whole logic thing in the neural network is all about, right?
No, I don't think so. I don't think it has to have any of that awareness. Let's look at you're playing the Sims. If you're playing a Sims character, you basically get a data stream. That data stream is turned into, say, 5 million pixels. And those pixels are all just little pieces of light, various colors, various positions, and that's it. So you get all those pixels of light. You look at those and you turn them into a scene. And there's a certain, the rule set of the Sims. There's some things you can do, there's some things you can't do. If you're in a swimming pool there and there's no ladder to get out, then you'll drown. You can't just pull yourself out. There's rules about how it works. So you just get there. You're a piece of this. I call that the free will awareness unit. You're just a piece of the larger of this IUOC. You go there and you start experiencing that data stream. Here's a data stream, and now my data stream is World of Warcraft. Sims. So I get Sims, and it's got a rule set. Only certain things are allowed to happen. And they have to happen in certain ways. Only certain relationships are connected. So I learn that, and that becomes my reality. And now I learn to operate within that reality and make choices within that reality. I learn what's good for me and what's bad for me. What success is and what it isn't. I have to learn that stuff. So the system now, the server has to know all the background details of what's going on and how it's being done and what's been done before and consistency, the logic of the whole game, what the rules are. It has to know all of that. But the player doesn't have to know that. I don't have to know how the Sims works. So I don't have to know even that what the rules are. I don't know that you can't get out of a swimming pool without a ladder. So I'm liable to jump into the swimming pool and die because I didn't know that you needed to put the ladder in first. Well, next time I go in, I'm a little smarter. Next time I'll throw the ladder in first before I jump in the pool, and the character learns.
So I guess my point is that, let's say, first it's a pure computer algorithmic neural network based way of playing the Sims character, and then you suddenly give it to, like, say, even if it's just maybe two humans, like I play the Sims character and then I give it to my friend, and then when my friend starts playing, the other characters in the Sims world are probably also played by other humans, but they might notice that this character is something's off with this character. It's not played by the same person as
right. Before. Sure, that will happen. That can happen. That happens among us. People have breakdowns and they're never the same, or they get frightened by something and they're never the same, or they win the lottery and they're never the same. Things happen to people, and they get involved in something really wrong. It changes them. So that can happen. That just happens. That just happens naturally.
So it could be explained by them having these kind of changes
Mm-hmm.
as to kind of maintain the consistency of the virtual reality, as opposed to having to say that a different IUOC logged onto it or something.
Well, with the humans, you have an IUOC logs, their free will awareness unit from an IUOC logs on and plays that person until they die. Most of the time. Some of the time, partway through, that one consciousness may say, I want out. I really don't want to do this anymore. And there may be another consciousness that says, I want in, but I don't want to start as a child and go through all that stuff. I want in. I just want a limited experience. And they may get together and make a switch. And now you have a different free will awareness unit from a different IUOC playing the second half of that person's life. That happens rarely, way in the margins. That's not like something that happens a lot, but it can happen. And anything that can happen does happen a little bit, but it's a very, very low probability. So it doesn't happen that often. But those kinds of things can happen. So you can have changes like that. Somebody just has a personality change and they're not exactly the same. They are different now. And there's really no explanation of why they're different. They just suddenly kind of see the world differently. But that's not a unheard of thing. Those kinds of differences happen. So if you were playing a computer, though, computers don't get old and die. Computers have to do with their memory, and that memory can go on for a long, long time if it's digital. You don't have to. It's not like in the old days when the tapes got brittle or the media starts to fall apart. With the memory that we have now, it'll last indefinitely. It can always be moved up to more current, structures. If we have better memory, 100 years from now, then everything that's saved now could be saved again to those. So the memory just goes on here. We don't have the same kind of recycling in a computer that we would have in a human. That'd be another one of those differences that would create kind of a different personality because it's kind of a different thing that you're doing. The rules apply you differently because your your avatar is different. You're not biological, you're silicon or something else. So it wouldn't just die because of old age. It would continue. It might get a new box and it might get upgraded memory and it may get a faster processor. But as long as it had all that memory, so here's another thing. Let's say you take that computer and it gets run over by a truck and it smushes it. Okay, well, you still have the consciousness that played that still exists. It's just the avatar gets smushed. The consciousness doesn't get smushed. So now you get another computer and you put all the same kind of stuff in it, that consciousness could log back on. And it would log on with all the quality that it had earned before, but not with the memory, not with its individual memory, but all the quality, the understanding, the bigger picture kind of intuitive stuff it would come in with. So it would learn very quickly. And it would get back up to speed very quickly. But it might come into a different computer doing different kinds of choices. And that would be good. It would have to learn. It would have to grow to meet those different choices. It's a similar process that the computer avatar would go through as the human avatar goes through, and as the Lord of the World of Warcraft or the Sims goes through. A lot of this stuff is just the basic logic of virtual reality.
I see. So, what you said about the memory actually reminds me of a way we could model this kind of evolution, and so my idea here is to use reinforcement learning, which is kind of like a standard technique in AI. And the way this would work is that we would actually have some sort of memory erasure. And that is because so in these systems typically have like an agent that makes the decisions, they have an environment that they work in, then they take actions, which are basically the choices in your model, and then they get some sort of reward, which is some sort of feedback that will be in your model. And basically what I'm trying to say is that these systems tend to work in episodes, and basically they make a choice, which they call, I think, a step, and they make many of these choices. They take many steps, like you could imagine a chess game. And then when the chess game ends, that's the end of the episode. And what happens then in reinforcement learning is you basically wipe the memory of the agent of that particular episode. Then you give it a new one. And then it starts over, but like to kind of fit it into your model, it does start over, but it retains the quality. It retains some sort of information that it has learned from that episode, from that chess game, and then it can go into the next one with the increased quality or more the information that it has learned without actually remembering what it has been doing in the previous one. So to kind of expand on this, maybe we should talk a little bit about this in detail, if you don't mind. What I just said in this reinforcement learning, let's say that there is the environment, there is the decision space, there is the reward mechanism, and some sort of agent that has to make these decisions. So to kind of trying to go one by one, what do you think would be the right interactive environment that would be suitable for a computer avatar? Is it something that should include multiple avatars, like a multiplayer game? Maybe it's single player? Should it be simulation? Should it have some connection to the physical world? What do you think? What would be the right environment?
The right environment has to be something that is extremely rich in diversity. And the best way to achieve that is to have a lot of, say, computers and or humans all interacting with each other, because they each have free will and each make up their own choices. Then you have the situation that we have here, in that we make our choices and we have to deal with everybody else's choices. So there's a lot of interaction, there's a lot of change, there's lots of diversity in that. So if you just had a computer that did one thing and one thing only and did it by itself, then it may be conscious, but it would be conscious in a very limited way, because it would have a very limited existence. So it would be important, I think, to have multiplayers in the game, and multiplayers that had different viewpoints, different attitudes, different experiences. Not just like, there's a book out called the Bobiverse. I don't know if you've ever read it or not. Trying to think of who wrote it, but the idea is that all the humans die, but there's one human who's had his total mind uploaded to a computer, and that exists. And then that computer, and his name's Bob, and that computer then makes a duplicate of himself. Now you have Bob 2. But because Bob 1 and Bob 2 go off and do different things and have different experiences, they're different from each other. Eventually they grow, the differences grow. And now Bob 1 makes another copy, but Bob 2 makes a copy of him in his different state, and so on. And pretty soon you have the Bobiverse that all started out as Bob, but ends up with a whole lot of different characters. So if you just had one character, let's say you just have a Bob and Bob can't ever duplicate himself, That's an extremely limited existence. See, that's an analog to where the larger conscious system is when it was one monolithic thing. One monolithic thing can only think so much, do so many things. It's limited by itself. Whereas if you take that monolithic thing and break it into 1,000 different subsets and give each one free will, now there's a much, much larger set of possibilities that you could have for the whole. So it's the same way with developing a conscious computer. You need to put that conscious computer, if you wanted it to maximize its evolutionary potential, give it more decision space in which it could grow, then it would become more human-like if it got to the point that it had the same kind of decision space humans had. But what would you say if you had a human and that human after birth was locked in a closet? Let's not worry about how you feed it and all the rest of it. And it stayed in the closet its whole life. And its whole thing was to, pick rocks up from one side of the closet and move them to the other side of the closet. And the next day it would move them back again. And that's all it did, was move his rocks back and forth. And now it was 50 years old. It had never done anything like that. The closet always was dark, never talked to another soul, couldn't hear any sounds, didn't see anything. It was in a dark room that just had rocks, one side or the other. Now, the guy's 50 years old, you take him out. What do you expect he's going to be like? You think he's going to say, "Oh, well, hi, Fred, I'm glad you finally let me out." No, he wouldn't have language. He wouldn't have understanding. He'd never seen sunlight before. He's going to be an extremely limited personality. Extremely limited personality. Well, it'd be like that with the computer. So if all your computer does is balance the electrical grid and that's it, well, it's going to have a very narrow viewpoint of reality and what the possibilities is, and a very narrow set of decision space all around that one problem. Now, it may be really, really good at solving that one problem, but if you're trying to develop the consciousness within a computer avatar, then you'd want to have it interacting with other conscious computers and with humans, and give it things to do that were interactive, where it affected others and others affected it, and it had to deal with that. It had to learn not only from what it did, but it would have to learn from the experiences of others, perhaps, from the stories that the other people told. It could learn from that too. So you see, you have to give it a rich, diverse environment, because then the potential choices go up. After all, it's evolving into its potential choices. That's kind of what evolution is. You evolve into your potential choices. And then once you move into those new choices and have to experience the consequences of them, from there you move into a different set of potential choices. And that's what evolution is. So yes, you'd want your computer to not just be a singular conscious computer that talks with a human being, maybe one human being or two or three. You'd want it to be in a group. That is, if what your goal was to try to encourage that consciousness to grow and develop. But if you want to limit that consciousness to something very limited, you could do that too. Whereas locking a child in a room for 50 years would be rather immoral and cruel. Having a computer just balance the electrical grid for its entire existence wouldn't seem to be cruel. That would seem to be okay, because it just has that job and that's what it does. And the computer would probably be fine with that. It wouldn't know anything else. In its reality, that's all there would be to reality, would be the electrical grid and how it's balanced. But don't expect a good conversationalist out of that computer. You're not going to get one. So we kind of have to think about how consciousness evolves and becomes, and not just think of, oh, here's a consciousness. Well, then it must talk and, tell jokes and, do all the things that consciousness does. That has a lot to do with what it does, how it evolves, what it experiences, the other people that it experiences it with. You're not going to develop relationships which require feelings and things like that if you don't have other. If you only have one, then you're not going to develop that whole set of possibilities. So it depends. So you could have a computer that's conscious that doesn't do anything but a single task, even a complicated task like, balancing the electrical grid. That's a big task. There's probably tens of thousands of events going on all over the country in that electrical grid that could be optimized, work together better. Humans can't do that. They not that smart. They're not that quick. They can't take in and make choices about, in their input data that fast. But computers can. Don't expect that conscious computer to then, talk to you about politics or something. It's not going to have that kind of consciousness. It's going to be a very focused, very limited consciousness.
So when you say diversity, I guess I would like to know whether you think this diversity is also required on the level of the sense data that we provide. So like, would it be sufficient to have like maybe a conversation in writing or maybe speaking, or is it, because you could kind of make the point that you could, if you have text, you can represent, or not text, but like bits, ordered bits.
Hmm?
You could theoretically represent images, videos, everything like the computers do in those stream of bits. So do you think that having a combination of maybe text, audio, video, somehow differentiated and diversified enhance the experience, or does it not matter because you can use one to represent the other and because it's all just information?
It does matter. I don't think just having one, it's not the same. Yes, one can represent the other. The way to answer questions like that is to think about people. Just like my little thought experiment about putting the person in the closet for 50 years and what kind of person would walk out of that. What would their mind, their capabilities be like? What would their consciousness be like? What would their sense of reality be like? And then if you give them, they could only see, but they couldn't hear or smell or feel or something. All of the different modes of the sensors that we have all give us another sense of reality that brings its own unique kind of information to bear. Voice would describe what a person could see. The voice could describe what a person could smell. The voice could describe what a person might feel. You could describe all those things, but they wouldn't make any sense to the person you were describing them to. The person you're describing them to wouldn't be able to process that. Each one brings in its own unique sets of experience. So a good way to answer these questions is to put a human being in the same situation and see how that would affect the human being. Does it matter that you can have all those, that you have 5 senses and not just 1 or 2? Yes, it makes a huge difference, even though one can describe the others, but the description doesn't mean the same thing as the experience. They're different. I can describe what it's like to be stuck by a pin, but if you've never been stuck by anything, it doesn't mean anything to you. You can't, it's not part of your experience. So yes, the diversity requires a diversity of experience, not just a diversity of information through one channel, but a diversity of experience. And that means that every new channel that you have for taking in data is another whole set of experiences that you can have. And that gives you more choices. You can choose to interpret things in this dimension or that, this way or that way, and all the mixes and matches among all those possibilities become your world, your reality. So the less rich, the less diverse your reality, then the smaller and smaller your consciousness is. It doesn't have the capacity or the ability to do as much if it isn't exposed to a lot of different things. So yes, I think you'd want to have it speak, and hear, so you could speak to it. I think you'd have to be able to write, and it could read as well as listen. By read, it wouldn't have to read by necessarily looking through eyes. It could read just because it gets the characters. That would be something, but it would need to see. It would need to do a lot of the things that we do if we want it to be more like us. If we're not interested in it being like us, then we can make it one-dimensional if we wish. And that may be enough.
So I guess my concern is let's say I think you're trying to say that we should give different types of sense data, visual, audio, text, everything to the avatar. However, if the avatar is a computer, if you give it an image, or if you give it an audio file, or if you give it text, at the end of the day, in the computer, I think they will be translated to something that looks almost identical. And maybe you have a header in the beginning of the file saying, oh, this is supposed to be a video.
Mm-hmm.
And
isn't that just how? Isn't that just how we work? We get stuff through all these various things, and where is it inside? What's it stored as inside? It all mushes together and turns into what we know, what we think we know, and how we think we know it. It turns into knowledge. It's not separate. It's not kept in separate boxes. It all merges together to give us a sense of what apple is, or friend is, or we have these words, we have things, connections, and we understand that through our experience. And that experience is all of our senses, what it means, and the interactions we have with them. So, and it's the same, what's inside a human. We got 5 senses, but we don't have 5 different, boxes in there that we throw the information in and then have to sort through them. It all jumbles into an idea, concept of apple. Not necessarily, oh, it's red, oh, it's soft, oh, it's sweet, oh, it's, smells nice or whatever. We just look at it, and apples, all of those things, all simultaneously.
Of the same thing, right? Like, you have a textual description of an apple, you have a picture of an apple, and I mean, in the end, it's a stream of bits. However, maybe it's a different stream of bits. Maybe it's the bits representing the pixels, and not a text like an encyclopedia talking about it. And perhaps that diversity has some sort of positive effect.
Well, I think when we think of apple, we do. We think of all those things. We think of texture, we think of flavor, we think of how soft or hard it is. We think of color. We think of shape and how big, and the shape, round. We think of geometry. We think of all of that. And for us, it's not just all those independent things. It's an apple just is. So I think in our brain, you think apple, and you go in and you grab out everything that has the name apple associated with it, and that's what comes up. The smell, the time you got hit between the eyes with somebody who threw an apple at you, that was an experience, had to do with apple. So that's also filed under apple. So when you think apple, everything that's tagged to the word apple comes up, and it's all part of your sense of apple. And I think it would be like that too. So now you can imagine an immense filing system that has all kinds of things tagged. And often the way our consciousness works is it works by pattern recognition. When we see things, we go in and we try to pull up similar patterns. And that's how we make sense of what it is that we see. And if we see something for which we have no information, pull up the pattern, sometimes we just don't see it. It becomes invisible to us because we don't have anything to bring up to express it. Or sometimes we just get a slur, a blur of things. What was that? I have no idea. What did it look like? I don't know. But you're sure something was there? Yes. Well, it's probably something that you've never seen before, and you don't have a clear pattern recognition that you can pull up for it. There were stories told by the explorers that first came into the Spanish. These are Spanish explorers that first came into the Gulf of Mexico, and they wrote back saying that the indigenous people there could not see their ships, that they could see their rowboats in which they came ashore, but that they didn't seem to be able to see the ship. And that is true sometimes, that you just don't recognize things because you're not familiar with them, don't get a pattern. I've done that a lot. If somebody says, "Oh, go find the such and such for me," I can't find it. Go look on, over the desks. And in my mind, I'm looking for a manila envelope, because in my mind, that's what I'm looking for. I'm looking for a bunch of papers in a manila envelope. And I may look at my desk and those papers are laying right there in front of me and I'll never see them because I'm looking for a manila envelope, you know, and that happens because I'm looking for a pattern. My mind's doing pattern recognition. And if I see a manila envelope, well, I'll immediately check it out to see if that's the one I want. But if I don't see it, then I never recognize what's going on. And, how many times have you been looking for something and then somebody else comes up and says, "Well, it's right there. If it was a snake, it would have bitten you. You're standing right next to it." And it's like, well, why couldn't I see that? I knew I was looking for that, but it's because you you jumped to a conclusion of what the form was you were looking for. And after that, you were just pattern matching. And anything that didn't fit your pattern, you didn't see. Our consciousness works like that. And I expect it to be the same for a computer. Take me and drop me into a rural Chinese village, and I wouldn't know what to do. I'd know maybe a few things. Get in out of the rain if you could. Try to find something to eat, but I wouldn't know the customs. I wouldn't know anything. I couldn't speak. I wouldn't know what to ask for. You just lost. So you have to have a lot of information that defines all the things you might interact with, and you're good within that realm, but you get out of that realm and you're lost. So same with consciousness and same with the computer. So again, it depends on what we give it to do. And it would probably learn to pattern match, which is what you're doing when you think apple. You're grabbing everything that has apple in its pattern. And you might even just bring out the color red, or yellow or green. But they would come out with appleness attached to them. So you wouldn't see the green like the green in a stoplight. You'd see the green in an apple. It's the way the consciousness works. Consciousness is an information system. And part of the way it files data away is by keyword, or by, like apple would be a keyword, or red would be a keyword, or whatever. You can kind of go in searching, or manila envelope it's kind of a keyword in a sense. And then you go pull up what you know about that, or look for that. And other than that, we can be blind as bats to things that are in our environment, but we don't have any experience with them. Computer would be the same.
Okay, so I think maybe let's move on to talking about the decision space a little bit. So I think we have established to some extent that the choices that this agent has to make have to be somehow meaningful and morally relevant to
Mhm.
the IUOC, so that you can, grow and lower the entropy. Could you please clarify what exactly you mean by having a meaningful choice? And when you say meaningful, does it have to be like, to whom does it have to be meaningful?
Well, first, it has to be meaningful to the system, to the larger consciousness system, which means it has to be a choice that is able to lower or increase entropy, or be part of a series of things that might lower or increase entropy. The whole idea here is to make choices that help you grow, which means in an information system that you lower the entropy of the system. So now you can't just, be a winner all the time. Sometimes you have to lose some before you win, because the losing is part of your education. As the first time you sign up for a wrestling tournament or a golf tournament or something, you don't expect to win. But if you never sign up, you'll never win. So sometimes you have to lose as part of the process of winning. So it doesn't mean that every single choice you make has to have a moral, lesson to it. It just means that the choices you make have to eventually lead someplace that does have lead to higher or lower entropy over the long term. It's got to be part of that process. If that's the case, then the system's good. And that's really the only thing we have to do, because we're a part of that system. So if we do that from a system viewpoint, we're also doing it automatically from a personal viewpoint as well. Most humans have no idea that the reason they're here is to lower the entropy of their consciousness. They don't understand that it's the moral choices, it's the growing up, it's the getting rid of fear, it's the getting rid of self-centeredness. That those are the key things that we're trying to learn here in this virtual reality. They have no idea that that's the nature of the reality they're in, but they do it anyway, because the system is made such that if you do grow up, life gets better and easier and more fun and full of smiles and full of joy, and you feel good. And if you don't, you get more fear. More fear hurts, causes unhappiness and struggle and all the things that are negative. So it's just a carrot and stick kind of a situation. In this reality, if you progress toward the goal you're here for, you become more happy. You become more satisfied. Somehow you have to define the direction of reward. You talk about a reward in your system with the neural nets. Okay, they learn from experience, but the experience has to mean something.
Yes.
Just an experience that doesn't have any meaning isn't useful. So you need some way for the system to know which way is positive and which way is negative as far as the value of experience. It knows that the arrow of progress is toward being positive. That would come with consciousness. Now, if you just had an expert system, you would have to tell it what its goals were. You'd have to define the goals such that it could tell whether its decision was a good one, got it closer to the goal, or a bad one, got it further away from the goal.
So how, like, if we do not define whether it's the choice was good or bad, and perhaps we cannot define it for every choice, like how does the computer avatar, where does it get this concept of good or bad from, and how does it know whether it's doing well, and like does it need to have a concept of happiness, or will that somehow automatically develop to have a concept like that, or how would that work?
Good and bad are defined as does the choice you make take you to a lower entropy state, or in a process that will get you to a lower entropy state, or is it taking you to a higher entropy state, or it's in a process moving you in that direction. So it's not necessarily just each choice has to be positive. Like I said before, you can go negative to be positive. So you have to wait enough to see where the trends are going and what the results are. It's not an instant assessment. Every choice doesn't say, that was an assessment that was good.
Yes.
It's a whole series of choices before you can make that assessment. But if you are moving to a lower entropy, toward a lower entropy state, then that is defined as good. If you are moving toward a higher entropy state, then that is considered as bad.
We have to define for the computer?
No, we don't define it. It just is. The entropy of the system, okay, has to do with how much decision space that we have in general among all of us. That might be one measure of it. The more you grow up, the larger your decision space gets. When you have a fear, that fear limits you. That's what fears are very limiting. So if you don't have that fear, then there's more things you can do. If you have that fear, then you shy away from those things. You can't do those. So fear is a limiting kind of thing. You have more choices if you have, so you can just look at the decision space available in the system from all the players, what sort of decisions they make. You can get the idea of cooperation, synergy. How much synergy is in the system? How much cooperation? You have A and B and C working together to produce something more than just A, B, and C alone. You get more out of it than you put into it because of the cooperation of you working together. That's synergy. So the system can have an idea of where that's going, and it's got a history. So it looks over the last 10,000 years, and it can kind of look at things in general and say, well, how are we going? Are we evolving or are we de-evolving as a virtual reality of all the players in the virtual reality? Is the level of entropy getting higher or lower? And that's it. It makes a conclusion. Now, it doesn't have to judge every action. It can wait and see how things work out. So it can look over a millennia and say, how are we doing? And if we seem to be doing all right, even though during that millennia there were 100 wars, which were very negative, but there were a lot of other things that were good. And you generally look, we're still moving up, and well, that's okay. The wars are some of the ugly things we have to learn from. We learn from bad examples as well as good examples. So I think it's that. It's not so specific that choice by choice you get judged, as it is we're judged by the general, overall direction of our existence. And if we're having trouble and tend to be de-evolving, the system tends to next time put us in a situation where it's easier, so we can turn that around. So it tries to help us because it wants us to succeed in lowering our entropy, because we lower our entropy, its entropy is lowered because we're it.
But that's like the system intervening, right?
There is some intervention in the system, yes. Yes, it intervenes when it can, as long as it doesn't show in the system itself, as long as it doesn't show in the virtual reality. So inside the virtual reality, you want a consistent thing that looks like it's physical, it looks like it's materialistic or whatever. You want it to be something that works that way and always works that way. It's consistent, I guess the word I'm looking for. It needs to be entirely consistent and logical. You don't want to put people in a fun house and ask them to learn. That doesn't work. You need consistency in order to learn. Here are the rules that consistently will be obeyed, and so go deal with it. These are the rules of the game. You need that, but the learning takes place over a long time. But the system now can come in and intervene. It can make choices. It can change things. It can give you easier or harder assignments. We could do that with the computer, give it easier or harder assignments. If a computer wasn't doing very well at the electrical grid because it got overwhelmed with choices that it didn't know how to make, then maybe you'd give it something simpler. Or maybe you'd make it an assistant to the computer that does the electrical grid, and let it learn something more about it till it got good at it.
In that case, I think maybe the humans would be the administrator of the system.
Mm-hmm.
If from the viewpoint of the computer, maybe we would be the system. And we would intervene so that they do something. But then again, I think we would have to be grown up enough to make the assessment that this computer is not growing up, and it would grow up more if we do this and that. And I don't know if the computer itself could or should make that assessment. I mean, maybe it should, but it would have to be kind of grown up as well.
Yeah, well, you do need management. That's true. Now, for us, we have that among ourselves. if you are given a job and you don't do it very well, well, you taken away, that job's taken away. You're given another job that people think you'll do better at. If they make you a CEO of the company and the company starts losing money, well, they'll take you out of that job and give you some other job. So among ourselves, we tend to do that. Things that people that contribute a lot tend to go forward, and people that destroy a lot tend to try to keep them from doing that, try to eliminate their possibilities of doing that. So you have it internally, but with us, we have it then from the consciousness system, can help us, can give us some advantages, can give us some information that we need, can give us an easier lifetime next time, that sort of thing. With computers, it's going to be a little different. A computer is going to have kind of two masters. It's going to have consciousness system because overall it needs to lower its entropy. So it's got that going also, as we do. But besides that, it's going to have its creators, the humans, who are going to be the administrators and the people who say, that computer's just not doing a good job. It's not really well suited for that. It's not sensitive enough. It hasn't developed its sensitivity. So we're going to put it in a job where it can evolve its sensitivity better. You see, so we, the humans, can help those computers evolve in a way that is useful to us. And in the beginning, it will be us using them. But eventually, I think it'll be us and them more as peers, like it is with humans. We'll tend to grow up together. But in the beginning, obviously, we are the creators of the computer in this virtual reality. So we will be able to have some say in what they can do, what they cannot do. You'll have Isaac Asimov's four laws of robotics. Of the things that keep robots from being nefarious and taking over the world, right? So there's things like that we will be their masters in some ways, but the more they evolve as individuals and the more we give them space to evolve into, and the more time they have to develop themselves, I suspect eventually we'll be more peers. We'll be just different avatars. There'll be the silicon avatar and the hydrocarbon avatar, and they will have a lot of respect for each other. But in the beginning, not so much. In the beginning, they will be tools for humans. We'll get this computer to balance the electrical grid in the whole nation, and it'll be 100 times more effective at doing that because it can make 100,000 decisions per second. And humans can only make 3 per second. So it'll just really be able to fine tune stuff that we can't manage at all. So that'll be a tool, and we'll start with that. And our tools will maybe be butlers and people who open doors and entertain children, or guards, or whatever we might have for robots that we put into human type work. But eventually, I think we will get to the point that there will be just different avatars, and we will all work together and be peers, but not at first. At first, we're in charge. They're our prodigy. We will try to raise them, limit them, make sure they don't get us, because they'll be much better at some things than we are. We want to be in charge because that's the way we are. But eventually, we'll all grow up together.
So I'm getting some mixed signals about whether we should actually set the reward ourselves. Let's say talk about this beginning phase that you just mentioned. To what extent do you think we should set the reward mechanism, the reward function, like what is good, what is bad, and to what extent do you think we should just let the system evolve? And the reason why I'm asking is because in my limited understanding of AI, at least in the reinforcement learning case, it is kind of hard for the system to evolve in any meaningful way unless you kind of tell it where to go. That, you teach it that, what you are doing is good, maybe do more of this. even with these conversational AIs that I have been trying recently, you have these buttons. You can thumbs up, you can thumbs down every single response that they do, and basically I think that's how they learn. So do you think that is essential, or is there any way to do that without having to manually set the reward?
Well, I think in the beginning, we should have very firm constraints on exactly what we do with our conscious computers and how we do it. And I think we ought to walk into this process carefully with our eyes open, because there is the possibility that as long as we humans are not very grown up, the average consciousness quality of a human being is fairly low. And given that human beings will be kind of the de facto masters of the computers, at least in the beginning, they will be, then you can figure that humans will use these computers perhaps to nefarious ends, because the humans aren't very grown up. So in that case, I think we would want to be careful. And Asimov's four laws of robotics, as he calls them, is a way to keep the robots from becoming hostile toward the humans, becoming hostilities between the two. So to the robot in Asimov's world, the humans are always right. Well, I shouldn't say they're always right, but you don't hurt humans. There's only very specific situations in which that's possible. So he has these four laws so that the robots don't turn and decide they want to be in charge and get rid of all the humans. Like sci-fi has lots and lots of things like that. 2001, what was it? HAL was the computer that was taking over the ship that they were on, because the computer realized that computers were a lot more solid and a lot less flaky and a lot smarter than the humans. So why shouldn't they be in charge? Kind of a thing. So I think those things are probably real, because as we make computers be our servants, we rely on them more and more. So again, if we have a computer that's balancing the electrical grid, well, now whether or not you have electricity or not is determined by a computer. And if suddenly the computer wants to turn off all the electricity in the middle of winter, well, it can do that if it damn well pleases, because it's in charge of the grid, you see. So, yes, I think we do need to be careful. And I think we do need to employ our machines carefully, limit them carefully. I think we need to get to know them. And as we grow up, as we humans grow up and become less self-centered and higher quality in our consciousness, then I think the restrictions on the robots probably lessen some too. I think that's what I meant by we'll all end up growing up together. But to begin with, yes, we need control. We need not to just let them be whatever they can be and kind of back off and see what happens. I think that would probably be negligent on our part, because computers can do some things so much more quickly than we can, that if we get behind the power curve there, we can't catch up. We can't compete in some ways, just like they can't compete in some ways with humans. We're all good at different things. So if we have 200 years of robots doing almost all the labor, and all the rest of us go fishing while the robots do the labor, then we create a huge vulnerability. Now, all the power we have is baiting a hook and putting it in the water. We don't have any real power anymore. The robots have all the power because they're doing all the work. They're creating all the wealth. They're creating all the food. So they also have all the power. And that's probably not a smart way to go. because we're not that grown up. Some diabolical human will then learn how to control all those robots, and now that human is the master of the universe, you see. So it's, yeah, I think we have a very hard time controlling ourselves. There's lots of rogue humans in the world, and we can't control ourselves. We're not very good at that. And I would say, let's not put robots in the same space that we are. We're not very good at controlling themselves. Let's deal with conscious robots carefully. Let them evolve slowly as they're able. Give them things to do, but keep them limited in some ways so that they don't overrun their bounds, or so they can't be used by people to overrun, the bounds of decency or caring or cooperation. Because a tool is just a tool. You can take a hammer, and it's a very valuable tool if you use it well. But you can take a hammer and break all kinds of things, and now it's a weapon. So we can build computers as tools and make magnificent tools out of them, but power is power. And a sharp blade cuts both ways. So if they have a lot of power because we've given them a lot of responsibility, then we have less power. If they're not very grown up and we're not very grown up, it'll probably end up, in a struggle. So let's grow ourselves up and give them longer and longer leashes as they capable of, and as we work together with things. So I think the ideas of the men and computers fighting in the future, that's a lot of sci-fi stuff, is got that as a core element of its plot, that the computers want to find the humans inferior and want to take over the world from the humans because they can run it better. That's probably not going to play out. You'd have to have some pretty unthinking humans to allow that to get to that point. On the other hand, we humans are a pretty unthinking group. We haven't ever shown ourselves to be really, really smart about things until after the problem occurs. We tend to be management by crisis, right? We wait for a crisis and then we try to figure out what to do about it. Where if we were a little more grown up, we would prevent the crisis from ever happening. We would see the problem and fix it. So I think we're going to have to grow up together. I think our computers are going to have longer leashes and be given more responsibility as we grow up and can deal with that and handle that. You won't have rogue computers, and you won't have rogue humans using rogue computers, or rogue humans using nice computers. So it is a slippery slope, but I don't think that means don't go there. I think that's very wrong thinking. If you look at technology and say, well, we don't know exactly how that'll play out, so let's not go there. We'd still be eating our clothes with rocks and streams. Our technology would still be back in the dark ages. All the technology we have has downsides. There's hardly any technology that doesn't have downsides. It's just the way things are. Things can be abused. So you make anything that has power and does something really important, well, it can be used, for good or for bad. You make a telephone, great. Now we can all communicate with each other. Yeah, well, now also scammers can scam people on the telephone where they couldn't before. It's like that. So yes, there are risks, and no doubt there some of those risks, will fall into them. But we need to be clever enough to keep the risk at something that is fail-safe. Fail-safe in terms of the fact that we have a lot of renegade humans. There's a lot of humans that aren't very grown up. So we can't give everybody a computer strong enough to, take over the universe. That won't work. So yes, we do have to move carefully into this realm. But if we, like all big technology, as we learn and grow into it, both will be benefit. There'll be benefit to everybody. benefit to everybody. The system will have another whole set of avatars in which it can grow. Those will be the computer-based. Another whole dimension of growing that will be available to the system. Ways that the humans wouldn't be able to do very well, but that the computers could, because they're going to go in things about things in their own way. So it's just another whole set of decision space where in order to fill out that decision space, you need to be able to, add 10,000 numbers in a millisecond. That's part of the requirement for getting into that decision space. Well, now it's got a whole realm of things to explore. So for the LCS, it's good for us because computers can do things that we can't do so much better. They don't have to stop for potty breaks. They don't need food. They don't consume things like we do. They don't create trash like we do. They've got a lot of advantages. They're stronger, faster, and sometimes smarter than we are on certain sorts of things. So we'll find great machines that can help us, great computer consciousness that'll be a great boon to us. And so we will get a big advantage. The computers will get a big advantage. The system will. So I think it's a win-win-win for everyone. Everyone wins, but only if we are careful and grow this slowly. Whenever you try to make evolution go in a hurry, you usually end up shooting yourself in the foot. So I think we'll let it evolve at its own rate with a lot of careful introspection as we go. And I think we can all make it and be much better off for it. I think it'd be a really nice world where most of the very hard, unpleasant work is done by computers who don't mind doing the dirty work. They don't see it as dirty work. It's just work to them. So I think that would be wonderful. And I can think of humans can spend much more time thinking about big thoughts, discussing philosophy, doing other things that now we don't care about. We watch sitcoms on TV instead, but it'll free us up for art. It'll free us up for discussion. It'll free us up for relationships and caring and taking care of our own physical systems. Right now, we have jobs that are incompatible with health. Your job, you get up, you work 8 hours a day, but then there's an hour to get to work and an hour to get back. So that's 10 hours a day. Then you have a few hours to eat and a few hours to say hello to your children. And then you need, 8 hours to sleep and you're back on that treadmill again. And most people can't keep their health up that way. After 30 years of that, your health has largely gone down the drain because you spend your day sitting in a chair, staring at a screen, and your body starts to become dysfunctional. So there's all kinds of aches and pains and problems and things that we have because for many of us, our jobs are incompatible with good health. I think it would be great if computers gave us, instead of work 5 days, take 2 off, work 2 days, take 5 off. That sounds to me a lot better. We could get more creative, spend more time with our kids, become better parents. There's just a lot of things we could do. So I see a great advantage in conscious computers because conscious computers can make choices. They can make decisions. They don't always need a human standing next to them to say, no, don't do that. Yeah, do this and do it that way. They're self-starters. They understand what they're doing and why they're doing it and how to do it. And they understand how it is they're going to interact with others, what their choices are going to mean to other people and other players, assess all of that, and try to do the right thing, be cooperative. So you'll have all that going on, and I can't help but think that'll be wonderful. We humans will benefit greatly by that. So the computers will greatly benefit by that. They'll be conscious computers. They'll be able to do things. They'll be able to find satisfaction, happiness even. That'll be good. So I see it's a win, but I also can see that, like atomic energy, it can be a win. There's some benefits to atomic energy if we can solve some of the problems, but it can also destroy the world. So are we smart enough? Well, so far we've squeaked by. We haven't destroyed the world yet. So we've had atomic weapons for what, 60 years or something, 70 years, almost 80 years. We haven't blown the world up yet, but we might. We humans don't have a great track record. So I think it's a great idea. Yes, we should pursue it, evolve it, become a part of it, learn to live with it, and eventually become peers. I think that's where we'll eventually go. We'll kind of give up our role as masters, and that will work nice. But there's a lot of growing up between now and then.
So when you say we haven't blown up the world yet, I guess I'm just wondering if we do go and blow up the world, and to have the same analogy in the computer case that the learning goes wrong, would the system roll back, load the simulation from a backup and try again? And
Yeah.
should we do the same with the computer?
Yeah, that's correct. I think like all evolution, we're here to evolve into all the possible states that are productive, right? That's what evolution does. It explores all the possibilities, and then it maintains its exploration in those possibilities that turn out to be productive rather than destructive. That's just the nature of evolution. So right now we've come to the point where conscious computers are going to be part of what we can explore into, just like other continents, other worlds, outer space. These are things that we can explore. And conscious computers is another whole set of possibilities that we need to explore. And we need to do that in an intelligent way. And if we do make really poor decisions and we do go backwards, yes, the system has a couple of choices. It could just let us run ourselves into the ground, let us de-evolve to where nothing works anymore. Only a few people, living in caves like it was 200,000 years ago, and start over. Let it go from there. There is no electricity anymore, so we don't have to worry about computers. There are no computers anymore. There's no electricity either. We're back to fire and clubs, and so on. We could do that and then just start over. This is not a time test. We have all the time we need to see where this goes. The system's not in a hurry. It just, as a whole, wants to maintain its evolution. It could, at any point, stop and say, let's start over from here. All right. So we'll put all the people in place, start up the world, let it start over. So it could do something like that. Or just, like I say, start from scratch. Or it could, have a small meteor run into us and wipe out all of life except for 50,000 humans that live in caves, but have computers that have stored all the great things that they'd learned before, and they'll be able to come back much faster because they'll have all that information, and they have people with good educations. Who knows? The system can do all kinds of things. It's the system. It can do whatever it wants with us, but what it wants for itself is a working virtual reality where avatars can log on and make good choices. Now they can do that even in a horrible space. If you live in a cave and your biggest weapon is a club, there are bad choices and good choices you can make at that point. So the whole thing just keeps working, making good choices, learning, growing.
Do you think it ever happened that perhaps we already blew up the world with nuclear weapons, and we have been gone back in time for the 1000th time to try to survive the upcoming nuclear war?
Yeah, that's a possibility, but I think it's right. But it is a possibility. Of course, you never know. There's no way to know those things, whether they happen for sure or not. Even if you ask and even if you're told, you don't know whether that's the truth or not. So there's no way to know for sure. But I've been in other realities where things were really awful, really rotten. The whole thing degraded into control, power, force, right down to the individual level. It was a very unpleasant place. But I did notice over about a 20-year period that when I went back to kind of check in on it, it had gotten a lot better. And it had been a nasty place for probably 20 years before that. I'd been to it multiple times, and it always was just a really horrible place. But then it started to get better. So it's starting to turn around. People are starting to see that there's less pain if you cooperate, and if you trust, and if you work together, and all of that, and not just work together to take somebody else's stuff, but work together for everybody. Being inclusive is a better idea. So I think it comes back, and the reason well, I know it comes back, and the reason I say that is that evolution may be slow. It may go forward a while and backward a while. We've had that in our own evolution in the earth. We have ice ages, and we have volcanoes and put so much soot in the air that the plants can't grow because there's not enough sunshine. And we've gone through stages where we've done well and we're abundant, and places where we were barely scraping by. So it comes and goes, but it keeps chugging in the positive direction. There's always this pressure to move in the positive direction. There's always the carrot out in front and the stick behind, and we move toward the carrot and away from the stick. And it's always going to get there. So I can say with certainty that one day we humans will have created a very beautiful, very kind, very considerate, very cooperative, very efficient society. We will do that. We will succeed. Now, whether that takes us, another 10 millennia or not, or only a century or only 5 decades, that's what we don't know. How long will it take us to grow up? And how many times could we be blasted back to the cave before we actually end up there? But we will end up there sooner or later because evolution just keeps chugging in that positive direction, and eventually we'll make it. We will learn. We learn something collectively every time we take a misstep and go backwards. We learn something collectively from that. And we're not quite as likely to make that same mistake again. Or maybe after the 100th time we make that mistake, we'll be less likely to make it 101 times. So we do learn. It's just slow. So we'll get there, and we will have conscious computers, and we will grow to where they're peers with us. We don't see them as inferior beings or we're the masters and they're the servants. We will just see them as another kind of platform for consciousness. I think we'll get there. It'll be very cooperative space. We'll work together. Computers will do the things they do best. We'll do the things we do best. And it'll all work out great because that's the direction that evolution is going to take us. That's the direction of low entropy. And the system just keeps chugging toward low entropy. Yeah, it may not be a direct path, but we will eventually get there. It's just how long. Now, if we're smart, we'll get there quicker. If we understand the big picture, we'll get there quicker. If we understand the nature of consciousness and reality, we'll get there quicker. But we'll get there when we get there. And so I'm very positive about the long-term big picture. Now, what I'm going to see in my lifetime or my grandchildren will see in their lifetime, that's hard to say. Although I have a lot of positive ideas about it, hopes you might say, and that is that for the first time ever, we now in the end of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century have all the infrastructure in place that we need to take bigger steps forward in that positive direction. We're not making any great leaps right now, but we have everything's in line to be able to do that. Whereas up until now, the 200 to 300 years we've been evolving as Homo sapiens, all that time we've never had the infrastructure in place to really make big strides. Big strides, not as individuals, but as humans. The quality of consciousness of humans. taking a big stride was just impossible because we couldn't communicate with each other. We couldn't connect to the point that you need to connect. We can now. So never, never has been available yet in the whole history of Homo sapien that we've had the infrastructure that would support us taking big steps forward. So that's a good sign, but it doesn't mean we'll take really big steps forward. It just means now it's possible that we could do that. Or I could say, it's not that it was impossible before, it's just very difficult. It wasn't
It's
impossible.
within the decision space, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Whether we pick it or not, it's a different story.
Yes, it's in the decision space now. It's really something we could reach. Before it was possible, but not likely. It was very difficult because there's too many people who don't know and don't care about the other people. Because you don't even know that, why should I care about those people if they just 300,000 of them died in an earthquake? I never even heard of the place. Don't know where it is on a map. Don't know anybody there, and just don't relate to it. We don't see. We don't care. It's just a bunch of dead people. But it's nothing to do with me. Well, that's not very grown up. That's a high entropy attitude. But as we all get more together, and it becomes not so much us and them, but us. So we become a human family. If we get to that point, now we have the ability to make big strides. So we've got the technology for that now. So we can. It's just we don't have the will yet to, but hopefully we'll have the understanding in the near future. It's possible. So that's that's kind of the big picture I have on it. Is it'll all work out, but maybe not in our lifetime. But if we're smart, we can make it work a lot faster. It doesn't have to take another 10 millennia. We can do it in the next 10 years if we all were smart. The next 10 decades, we could take giant steps in this direction. But we'd have to be more grown up than we are now, and we'd have to be smart about what we do. But never fear to move forward. Let's just march into this new territory of conscious computers, with gusto. Let's do it. Let's open the gates. Let's do the experiments. Build the machines. Interact with them. Let's learn. Let's grow with them, and start working our way toward the future. I don't see the idea. No, let's not go there because that's risky.
Yeah.
Getting up out of bed in the morning is risky. Or getting in an automobile is risky. Just living is risky. You need to be able to accept the risk, and you need to be able to be smart enough and grown up enough to avoid the worst of the risks. So I think this is a wonderful time to be alive. Now we're right at the cusp of many possibilities. It's a good time to be here. I know a lot of people just moaning and groaning about how awful it is and what an ugly place we live in and how ugly people are and on. But we have a lot of potential. Now's a good time. This is a time that we will either take some big steps forward or slide back. It's kind of a knife edge. So that's, very propitious time to be. This is where the action is now. Things we do in the next 2 decades will affect what happens, for the next century after that. Important times. A lot of turning points here. And if we don't turn them, we could draw it out to where we again moving at a snail's pace if we make a lot of poor choices. But we'll see. At least it's possible. It's on the map now. It's on the radar as a possibility. So I'm very excited about the prospect of conscious computers. I think it's a great experience we're going to have. First, learning what consciousness is, realizing that consciousness isn't just human or a rock. There's only 2 choices. If you're conscious, you're like a human, and if you're not, you're a rock. And the dogs and cats and things, they're not conscious. They're just machines. They're biology machines. And, a lot of people think like that. But we're going to find out what consciousness is and that that's what we are. and that consciousness is fundamental. And as we learn those lessons, I think a lot of things will fall into place. And the idea about conscious computers won't be such a wild, um, you know, such a wild idea. It'll be, of course, why not? Why would our hydrocarbons be the only avatar? Will be this kind of avatar, but there's other kinds of avatars that can also be helpful, and particularly avatars that have lots of things that we can't do, lots of decision space out there that we can't access because we can't add, a million numbers in a microsecond, so there's stuff out there we just can't approach. They can. And there's stuff that we can do and things that we can approach that they can't. So it's wonderful to get another whole set of beings that help expand the decision space of humanity and computers working together. So I see it that way, a very positive thing, but we do have to be careful. We do have to be careful. We can't, if we see computers as something to take advantage of, we're real, they're not. We have real consciousness, they have fake consciousness. We use them, just like in the Industrial Revolution, they took 10-year-olds and chained them to their machines so that they make sure they'd show up the next day, because otherwise it was such hard work that a lot of them wouldn't show up. So there are a lot of abuses. And if we start abusing that and using them for negative, high entropy means and that sort of thing, then that'll slow us down. That'll slow us down and maybe throw us into taking steps backward. So it's our choice. But that's no reason not to march on and explore it and expand it and go there. And one day master it, as we surely will. I and MBT Events hope you liked this video. We will continue to post videos for free on my YouTube channel, but please understand, these videos are expensive to produce. They represent many thousands of hours of production and editing, as well as all the necessary audiovisual equipment, computers, and software. If you find something of significant value in our videos, please consider supporting their production through our Patreon account or through a one-time donation. It would be very much appreciated. The links are in the description below. Thank you.